So how much can astrology really predict your relationships?
That's well asked. Well done, Joanna. Well done.
Thank you.
So I'm going to look at you. I'm going to look at the camera. So as far as I'm concerned, astrology would be like 5%, 10%, and it's a critical 5 or 10%, but it's only a small piece of the puzzle. So I've said it and I've refined it, and I've actually worked on a podcast around it. In my estimation, there are 4 variables that contribute to compatibility. And so there's the nature, nurture, astrology, and spiritual progress, if you will. So it's good on paper, good in person, chemistry, and then the variables that have to do with how old your soul is. And so the first 2, good on paper is easy. It's the things that you can measure. If you're very well educated, if you're, particularly attractive, if you're a certain age, like you wouldn't take a 25-year-old and set them up with a 55-year-old, for example. Probably not. Maybe, who knows? Okay, maybe more realistically, you wouldn't take an American girl from LA and set her up with some Chinese immigrant who, just arrived, who's 30 years older. Like, there's qualities that ultimately would define basic compatibility, and those are qualities that you can measure on paper. And that's why when you go onto a dating site, you list off your 10 or 20 criteria, and you check off all these boxes, because you know that the site has 50,000 eligible, bachelors, but there's only maybe a cross-section of 500 of them that you want to date, because they fit into the good on paper criteria. And then there's good in person, which is another way of saying just the physical qualities. And so the data actually supports this quite convincingly. Wherever you fall, if you're generically a scale of 1 to 10 on attractiveness, if you happen to be, say, a 6, right? Your most likely match is likewise a 6. And men can vary by 1 number, say they can date a 5 or a 7, and obviously everyone wants to date up. Women have a little bit more variance. They're willing to take on somebody who may not be quite at their level of attractiveness, because they're going to value more substantive qualities in the male, whereas the male's going to disproportionately value the physical, right? So that's good on paper, good in person. That's 1 and 2. The third element, which is what astrology works so hard to try to predict, is chemistry. And that's trying to understand why, if you met a group of people and you talked to 10 people in a night, and we talked about this, I think, in one of our other videos, why is it that one of them, who maybe wasn't the most attractive or the most interesting, but one of them left you a lasting impression? And there was something that you connected with that one person. Or you work with people, and over the course of weeks, months, or even years, there's relationships that develop where you just feel in sync. And it's not just romantic, it works in all facets of your life. Family dynamic is a perfect example of astrological compatibility. And so what astrology is doing in this context is predicting that 5 or 10% of chemistry. Right? You can find the perfect guy in the perfect setting and yet have no chemistry with him. You can find the imperfect guy in the most bizarre of settings and yet feel remarkably connected to them. All right? The final and 4th variable, which I've asked mystics, I've talked to a great Kabbalistic lecturer, I've included my mentor in this conversation, which is trying to predict the age of your soul. And the reason I say the age of your soul is really just another way of saying how far are you in your spiritual progress. And the reason that's important is because old souls, those that are spiritually adept, are notoriously inclined to keep the company of other old souls. And they'll make huge compromises, because as your soul ages, there's fewer and fewer people that you connect with. Which is why, generally speaking, the older the soul, the less you know about them. They're less drawn to the public eye. They're less drawn to material accomplishments. They're less inclined to try to make their name and leave behind an amazing reputation. They start to live with a much greater degree of compassion and empathy. They go to incredible lengths for altruism and philanthropy. They start to see the collective of mankind, which is the connections, as opposed to the individuality, which are the divisive qualities. And as a result, those old souls want to be with older souls. And to be frank, young souls have very little interest in that. Young souls are going to spend a lot more time in a more ego environment, which is self and self-accomplishment and motivation. and as a byproduct, they're going to naturally connect much better with souls of their same maturation. So, how important is astrology? Well, it's the chemistry. It's a huge piece of it, but without the other elements in place, you could have amazing astrology. Like, you could have incredible astrological compatibility, but if the good on paper or good in person, if you're not physically drawn to the person, or of course if the astrology lines up, but one is an unbelievably old soul who's on a very deep spiritual path, and the other one is still establishing a name for themselves, it doesn't work.